And welcome back to another episode of AlphaCast. I'm Mike Winter, and I'm here as always with Dr. Bear Paul Lando. Today we have an amazing guest, super excited about this one, Dr. Andrew Kaufman. He's joining us today to dive deep into all sorts of fun topics. Dr. Kaufman is a healing consultant, inventor, public speaker, forensic psychiatrist, and expert witness. He completed psychiatric training at Duke University Medical Center after graduating from the Medical University of South Carolina. While a BS from MIT in molecular biology, Andrew has conducted and published original research and lectured, supervised, and mentored medical students, residents, and fellows in all psychiatric specialties. He has been qualified as an expert witness in local, state, and federal courts and held leadership positions in academic medicine and professional organizations. Dr. Kaufman has gained tremendous popularity in recent months, sharing a different perspective on the role of health and disease within the context of current pandemic fears. So let's welcome Dr. Kaufman to the show today. How are you today, sir?
I'm doing well, and thanks so much for having me. It's great to be on with you guys. I've seen a lot of your material, and it's quite good. And Bear and I have had a chance to appear on a panel together, so it's really nice to be among friends.
Yeah, Andrew, it was really fun sharing the panel with you and Kelly the other day. Had a lot of fun with that. And thank you so much. I know you've been busy and really making a splash out there. So you've been stirring up a lot of trouble out there, young man. What do you have to say for yourself?
Guilty as charged. Yeah, well, it's just, it's so important to speak the truth to this issue because the consequences of what's happening now are so serious and unprecedented. So, it's like the risks are not an issue. It's like you have to take the risk to get this information out there so people can understand what is really going on and make the best decisions so that we can have a nice, free life in the future, for us and for our children and the next generation.
Yeah, I spent, as you and I know behind the scenes, I've shared a little bit with you, I specialize in biotrain medicine, which is a type of medicine where you manage the internal ecology of the body and you don't treat disease and you don't attack microbes. And it's so wonderful because I spent 40 years doing that and, taking serious cases and people coming in and seeing me as a doctor of last resort. And so when they'd come in on their viral meds and their antiviral meds and their, chemo for AIDS and that kind of thing. And then I tell them a whole different story, it's like telling them that the moon landing didn't happen. So just the fact that you're out there going mainstream and you obviously are a very credible source with your background and your education. And so people are really taking note in the mainstream of things that, was a pretty hard sell for people like myself in years past. So I'm really welcome your message and thank you for sticking your neck out there.
Yeah, well, thank you for noticing. And, I do have the mainstream credentials and that definitely helps a lot. But I've really come to the same conclusions that you were aware of many years ago. And I wish I had learned about that sooner. But terrain medicine is the same model, I believe, to be accurate. And in my consultation practice, I give people information about that. And I've used those principles when I've been ill or members of my family, and it's really helped speed up the recovery. And, these illnesses have not come back, and it's been, just wonderful to take this different, safe approach that just works without the toxicity.
Yeah. So I know you're multifaceted. You have a lot of other interests. Of course, you've been talking a lot about this whole COVID situation because it's what's got our attention. And I know your other interests, including, gardening and farming and spagyrics and all sorts of things. And I think we all have a little bit of COVID fatigue these days, but it is an extremely important message because we're not through it yet, not through the pandemic, but through we'll say, in my opinion, only the propaganda campaign. So I think it's maybe important that you share with our audience, and I think they probably have expectations of getting into that subject matter a bit, and you're the best at talking about that. But if there's anything else you want to talk about, if time allows, love to chat about anything, because we're a little bit different here. We like to be eclectic and, in our outlook of things. So just go ahead wherever you want to start.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm also kind of getting fatigued talking about viruses, and frankly, it's not really my main area of interest. I've been, studying natural healing and the history of medicine and all of this kind of stuff for the past several years. And, there's a lot to learn, and I have a long list of reading materials, mostly books, to learn more about various aspects. Like these days, I'm very interested in water. And trying to study that as much as possible. But the situation in the moment dictates some focus on what's going on. So I'll be happy to fulfill my responsibility to bring that message. And, what I've really done is it's not that surprising or sophisticated. I've just taken the evidence that has been put forward by the scientific and public health establishment and just looked at that from a scientific perspective. So there are, currently, I believe, 4 papers that have been published in peer-reviewed journals that, claim to have isolated a new virus and say, actually, the conclusions of the papers say that it is associated with a disease or potentially associated with the disease or is implicated in a disease. But none of them can conclude that there's a causal relationship because the studies are not designed to be able to draw that conclusion. And in fact, what I found in looking at these studies is they are not really designed to be able to even identify a virus. There are many ways to go about this, and there are certainly, I've talked about Koch's postulates, which are a simple set of rules by which the germ theory proponents have suggested as a way to prove that a specific germ or microorganism causes a disease. But none of those have been satisfied for any viral or allegedly viral caused disease. And if you look clearly at how they design these experiments, they don't follow one of the basic principles of experimental design, which is to separate variables so that you could test them independently against whatever outcome you're looking for. So what they instead do is use impure samples with many variables combined, and then pick out the data that they want and say that it proves this or that or the other thing. Like, for example, the only way that they said that this virus that they allege to isolate is a coronavirus is that they sequenced the RNA, and which came from an undetermined source, an impure source. And then they said it was almost 80% identical to another piece of RNA from another coronavirus, the SARS-CoV-1 virus associated with the SARS outbreak in 2003. But that sequence was also determined by an impure sample, and the source of it is unclear. But having less than 80% sequence identity is really not very strong correlation, because like the sequence identity between humans and chimpanzees is 96%. Yet we're very different from chimpanzees, not in the same family at all, although there is some relation, of course, because we're related to all other creatures. But so how can they say that, it's like that virus with such a low identity between the sequences? And, then they claim to have isolated viral particles and show them under the microscope. But if you once again look at the procedures, they're mixing this with other things, especially foreign mammal cells and antibiotics, which creates exosome particles, which look just like viral particles under a microscope. But then they don't account for those viral particles when they show the microscope images. So, what exactly are they showing? It's unclear, because they have, once again, an impure sample with different types of particles, and they make no account of this. So essentially what I've been able to reason from looking at these experiments is that there's really no proof that they've isolated anything that would be consistent with their definition of a virus. And they certainly haven't come close to showing any causal relationship between any new disease. And if you look more broadly at the data on mortality and such, you'll see that there's really no evidence of a new disease either. So, my interpretation and conclusion with respect to, looking at all of this information is that this pandemic is completely manufactured. It's like the biggest public relations stunt that's ever been perpetrated on us in the history of humanity.
You could go as far as to say it's a false flag, really. I mean, it's an operation.
Absolutely. So whether you want to call it a false flag, a psychological operation, a public relations stunt, I think those all kind of mean the same thing. But the false flag is important because, it is for the purpose of carrying out some policy, right? That, it's like a problem, reaction, solution type of scenario. And, the problem is the pandemic, the reaction is fear. And the solution is taking away our First Amendment and other rights.
Order out of chaos, as they call it.
So, that's a whole discussion topic we need to get into. But going back to the virus and the particles that they are seeing, so where do you feel that those are? What's that all about?
Yeah, well, when they almost all have the same procedure where they take cells, like the most common ones are vero cells, which are cells from the epithelium of monkey kidneys. And then they mix antibiotics with it, and then they mix lung fluid with it. And antibiotics are known to induce exosomes, and exosomes are these small particles. They're little sacs of fluid. They contain genetic material, including RNA, just like they say the SARS-CoV-2 virus contains. And they're secreted by cells at a baseline rate, at a low rate. But when they're mixed with things like antibiotics, and there are several studies that show this, they crank up the output of exosomes. And it's a response to basically a toxin that the cell's exposed to, which the antibiotics, I'm sure you covered this before, but anti means against, and bios is life. So they mean against life. And they are toxic to virtually all cells, depending on the specific antibiotic. So this basically induces the exosomes. So also, it's known that people who have acute infectious illness, like a respiratory illness, which is what we're talking about, they also put out exosomes, and they've even been detected in the lung fluid. So you have two sources of exosomes in the sample that they're looking at, those that may be from the lung fluid of the sick individual, and then those induced by the antibiotics from the vero cells. So when you take that sample and look under a microscope, where are those exosomes? Because they have to be in there, because you basically created a recipe to make exosomes. And like if you look at the exosome research, you'll see that there are papers like that where they mix cells with antibiotics and then see the exosomes. So they're there, but when they show the images and discuss the findings, they never mention that we differentiated this virus from the exosomes by X, Y, and Z factor. And that would probably be possible to do if they took it into account. So since they haven't taken it into account, and that they're there, the only conclusion I can reach is that what is being shown under the microscope are actually those exosomes. And in looking at different photographs of exosomes and viral particles, they both have a range of sizes and appearances. But if you look at the whole set of each that from the literature, you'll see that it's really impossible to distinguish them visually. You would have to do some kind of chemical test to show that they're distinct.
And that's through an electron scanning microscope, right? So that would be a stained black and white image.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So
I'm curious. Go ahead, Bear. I was just going to say, I'm curious if anybody's done this with the dark field microscopy, because that was always my thing when I was looking at Wuhan. Even I got caught under the spell of contagion because of all the crazy footage, right, coming out of there, people collapsing and being locked, sealed into their homes, and hearing stories of going through the air conditioning ducts and stuff. And so even I was like, whoa, my God, what is this thing? And so following some channels, people were saying, well, this and this and that and that. I'm like, well, you know what? We're not going to know what this is until Dr. Lando gets somebody with these crazy symptoms, pulls their blood out, and looks under a dark field microscope to see really what we can see here. And I don't know, has that been done at all?
Well, is there a dark field microscope with enough magnification to see particles on the 100 nanometer scale that's currently in existence?
No, absolutely not. Royal Rife came the closest with his universal microscope, and I'd love to have that technology back. So with dark field, because you lack the resolution, but you can't see things in other ways. And then there's things we could talk about later in if we have time, where you challenge the blood in certain ways in order to get byproducts from these elements that you can't see in great enough resolution. And then depending on the production of certain byproducts, you can make very good educated assumptions that we would always base clinical practices on. So what you're suggesting, though, if I hear you right, is exosomes are possibly a mechanism in the body to self-heal.
Absolutely, and there's good research to back that up. Especially this one study that I came across, and I think I presented this in one of my slideshows. But they had some kind of mammalian cell culture, and they mixed it with a bacteria that was producing endotoxins. And bacterial endotoxins of this sort work by basically boring holes in the cell that they're exposed to, and then the cell would leak out the contents and result in cell death. So what they did is they took this culture of cells and divided it, and half of the cells they mixed it with something to induce exosomes, and the other half they didn't. And then they mixed both of those divided cell cultures with the bacteria with the endotoxins. And what they observed is that the cells that they had induced exosomes survived, and the other cells perished. And they actually captured some really striking images of the endotoxin molecules being taken up into the exosomes. And they colorized this after the fact to show the appearance more clearly. And it was quite striking, to see this. So I think this is one of the only experimental evidence available that exosomes can actually take up toxins when they're in the extracellular space. So this could, be a major function that they perform, and they could package it up so that it can't harm the cells, and then hopefully be able to remove it from the body entirely.
And exosomes are the topic or the subject of a lot of research in stem cell therapy. Is that not right? Where they found that the exosomes, which are actually a product of endosomes, which is their invaginations of the cell, and then the endosome picks up the RNA, and then that creates the exosomes that are then expelled into the terrain. And then those, in fact, turn or induce secretion of different interleukins and things, and stimulation of stem cell production. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, that would make sense. And, you're right. They're produced inside the cell, and they're in larger vesicles, sometimes called MVEs, multivesicular endosomes, which basically contain more than one of these exosomes. And then they, merge with the cell membrane at the right time and release all the exosomes outside of the cell. And they do contain genetic material. They've been shown to contain DNA, both double and single-stranded. They've been shown to contain mitochondrial DNA, and they've been shown to contain RNA, including both messenger RNA and microRNAs. And on the exosomes, they have a receptor, which is like a lock and key mechanism that sends them to a target cell. So they'll have a special lock, and it'll only fit the key of the target cell. So if you would find an exosome that has the right key for the central nervous system, you could go about this type of procedure, if it was matching up with certain stem cells. And then the way the primary function of the exosomes is thought to be remote communication. And that information is actually contained in the genetic material. So they would bind the target cell through this receptor interaction, the lock and key mechanism. then they would insert their contents into the target cell, and the genetic material could then be integrated into either the nucleus or the mitochondria where it could be expressed. And then that could change the phenotype of the target cell. So it could be a vehicle to administer gene therapy. Absolutely.
Yeah, brilliant. There's another thing I'd like to get your thoughts on. In terrain medicine, one of the labs I do is one of the components is you look at cell debris. And when the cell debris is at a certain level, it just suggests that there's a high turnover of dead cells and maybe out of balance with the production of new healthy cells. And when it reaches a certain point, we always theorized and had ways to measure actually that it reduced the milliamperage of the regular cells, which would, demean the health of the entire bioterrain. And but it also stimulate mechanisms within the regular cells to start secreting surfactants and things with the interaction of this cell debris. So, which again was another, we don't have the type of studies to prove this. It's just based on functional medicine and the results and certain things we'd apply when we'd see that seemed to work. And so do you think that just regular fragments from dead cells could also be confused with virus? Or is that just something totally different?
Well, Bear, that's a great question. And actually in the virology literature, going all the way back to the 1930s, like, and especially this kind of landmark paper by Rivers, where he laid out an easier way to prove that viruses cause disease, he even mentions that. And there was a lot of debate because early in the age of electron microscopy, there was a lot of details to work out. So they, in disease, you're more likely to see cellular breakdown and all kinds of different debris. And that would actually include exosome particles and apoptotic bodies and necrotic cells and such. And, this was seen as artifact, but it's very difficult to differentiate from the signal. So this has always been a problem in looking under the microscope at these images, how to determine what's this and what's that, what's a virus, what's debris, what's an exosome, and that was before exosomes were described as a distinct entity from viruses. I think this also plays out in the current papers because the virologists doing these studies that I was describing earlier should be aware that other artifacts may be misinterpreted as viruses, but yet they don't seem to account for this problem whatsoever.
And are you talking about Dr. Thomas Rivers?
Yes.
In the 1930s, who the famous virologist for the Rockefeller Institute, who waged war on the basically polymorphism, and he was really ardent in proving monomorphism because that fits within the virology narrative, right? So when we factor in things like Béchamp was talking about and Royal Rife and people we've discussed with polymorphism and how these things can literally morph into other things, that opens up a whole other bag of worms for these guys who really still want to be like Pasteur and say a lot of stuff's dead inside or it's very mechanistic, right? And they're denying this kind of more divine apparatus within us.
Absolutely. And, in these recent papers, there's another aspect to it that I was just trying to get straight in my head, but they always describe, so they mix the lung fluid, right, with the viro cells and the antibiotics, and then they wait a few days, and they always describe that there is tissue damage or cell damage, right? And they, of course, attribute that to the virus. But what that most likely is actually from the antibiotics. And so they're totally missing what's going on. So they're mistaking a virus for an exosome, and they're mistaking the cell damage from a virus for the cell damage from antibiotics.
They do that a lot.
They have no controls. They're not using a control in the experiment at all.
Yeah, they seem to do that a lot where they look at the after effects of things they cause themselves. It's like the whole antibody thing where if you have the antibodies, then you're good. But then if you have the antibodies, you need a vaccine. It's like, what side of the antibodies am I good? Like,
Yeah, well, there's a long history of this, that, you know, the medical establishment refuses to acknowledge what's called iatrogenesis, right, which is when they cause the problem. So, like, going back to the 1800s, when they were using mercury and arsenic based medications to treat virtually everything, they started getting cranial neuropathies, right? Like Bell's palsy,
yep.
where the nerves in your head start to fail and you get facial asymmetry and all sorts of other issues. And instead of realizing that, oh, could this be from the neurotoxic mercury that I'm giving to the people, they just assumed it was some new disease that was popping up.
President Lincoln was famous for throwing fits because of the quicksilver, the mercury that they were prescribing to him, which was they called quicksilver, which was where the original term quacks comes from. I talk about this a few times here. I don't know if I mentioned on the podcast, but you know, we're naturopaths and people that are doing alternative from the mainstream are called quacks these days, but that term actually comes from the original quicksilver doctors in the late 1700s. This is from what I've been told. And in the South, with their accent, they called it quacksilver. So they were called quacksilver doctors, which then by short were just called quack doctors and then just quacks. So the original quacks were the allopaths, were the ones that were using the chemical constituents. But due to the inversion of reality, now it's the natural healers that are called quacks.
Well, Mike, that's a really important point. And actually, the way that got inverted to naturopathic doctors was by a man named Morris Fishbein.
Oh, yes. Good old Morris.
Right. One of the first presidents of the American Medical Association. And his thing was all about cutting deals with various pharmaceutical and food companies and magazines that the AMA would officially endorse their products, and then they get a cut of the proceeds. But he himself, before he joined on to that effort, which came out, you know, after the Exner report, and they changed over the healthcare education system in the country, he was actually accused of being a quack in his practice. So if you check out Eustace Mullen's book, Murder by Injection, it goes into some detail on that. I think it even shows the newspaper ad that called him a quack.
That's amazing. Fishbein, we talked about, Bear and I talked about in our Royal Rife Alpha Cast. If anybody wants to go through that whole history, we discussed that in depth with his whole, you know, he basically went after Royal Rife and all that stuff. And that guy was a blatant criminal, really.
Absolutely.
I met up with Eustace Mullins just in the last couple of years before he passed on, and he entertained us with a lot of good stories. He's definitely a legend, and he's, of course, the one that inspired G. Edward Griffin, who we also got in cahoots with some of our events we used to put on, where he was a feature speaker as well. So a lot of great pioneers out there.
Yeah,
so
I think.
Go ahead.
I just want to say, I think that Griffin's book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, is one of the most important things for people to read. It's a landmark in and of itself.
Hear, hear.
Absolutely. So back when I was in naturopathic college, I was in my 20s, and I used to sit in Friday assembly. We had a big auditorium where we'd have a guest speaker come from some part of the world. And I always sat next to this old naturopath who was 95 years old. And I'm in my 20s at that point, and he used to tell me all these stories about his life as a naturopath back in the early 1900s, when they were the prominent doctors of the day. And then they were summarily persecuted, thrown in jail. Some of them even lost their lives, their house burned, their families harassed, schools were shut down, legislative bodies were compromised so that they actually negated the ability to get a naturopathic license in the first place. There was a 4-story library of natural healing, one of the most extensive libraries of the sort ever to exist in Philadelphia. That was burnt down to the ground. And this was, of course, all coinciding with the burgeoning petrochemical industry and the Rockefellers and their whole form of medicine. So I got a good bird's eye view just from, or firsthand experience from this guy. Is really fascinating. If it's okay, I'd like to just kind of go back to another piece of the microbe situation there. We talked about virus, and there's another thing I hear. Well, I'm very familiar with it because I watch it under the microscope for years. But my original training in trained medicine was from the German schools with Gunther Enderlein, and then I studied with Gaston Naessens. And of course, we talk about the cyclogeny of organisms that actually live in our body and our body's natural recyclers. And in Germany, they call them protids, and Gaston called them somatids. But in either event, these are just single proteins, apparently, that then differentiate, and I watch this with my own eyes, into higher valence organisms that then do particular functions in the body. Now, in the discussions I hear in the public these days, some people are suggesting that those protids they think are actual, maybe what we're mistaking for virus. I don't think so myself. I don't know, other than just what I see. I think virus are more related to cell fragments and exosomes. Again, I have no way to prove it except through therapies based on those assumptions. And the protids, I believe, also are triggered to go through their various functional cycles by these cell fragments or exosomes that also trigger their production to go into a particular phase of activity to also help heal the ecosystem. So do you have any thoughts or experience with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And, let me say that when I first saw a video under the dark field microscope of this cyclogeny process that you're talking about, I was just blown away. I mean, it was like I had to pinch myself to see if what I was seeing was real, because it's so different than anything I ever learned. And I think it's really important to note that all of the microscopes used by the medical establishment, from research through clinical work in every sector, only can look at dead tissue. So they can never observe the behavior of these cells. And so they would never see actually microbes budding out of our own cells, which is what happens. I mean, I've seen it with my own eyes now. And I encourage other people to look at it, because this is the true science of reality of what goes on in our bodies. I think it's hard to say what exactly the relationship between exosomes, viruses, and somatids are, but looking at some of the work of Stefan Lanka, who talks about bacteriophages, or which are the so-called viruses that form in bacterial cultures. And so we know about spores from bacteria, right? When environmental conditions are not right for growth, the bacteria can form a spore, which protects it from the environment, from extremes in the environment, and puts it into like a stasis, kind of a hibernation type of state. And then later on, when the environmental conditions change, it can basically go back into an active growing form. And so he uncovered some experimental evidence that phages actually may be related to that, and may be a form where the environmental conditions are even harsher. And there's research that an entire bacterial colony can be generated from a phage. So possibly this is what we're seeing in the somatids, is that it's actually, similar to a spore or a phage state. And it probably contains some of the genetic material in addition to the protein, although I don't know if it's been chemically characterized. You might know more about the research on that. And then it can basically, as you said, differentiate, which would be the term they would use in mainstream microbiology, into more mature species that would be, recognized by any common microbiologist under the microscope, like Staphylococcus or Clostridium or Candida, any of those species. But it's a really fascinating field, and something that I definitely need to learn a lot more about.
It's definitely a powerful experience. Sorry, Mike, go ahead.
I was just going to say, can I just say one thing that's funny about the microscopes and such, is talk about it as above, so below. Everything is, in relation to the mainstream, is about dead. from the corporations to their microscopes. It's all about death. What is going on there? Anyways, I wanted to throw that out there because it just hit me like a ton of bricks that even their microscopes look at dead things.
Well, I am always aware of some of the 7 hermetic principles applying to healthcare, and so it's great that you bring that up. Definitely a welcomed analysis.
So I was going to go into the next part of the discussion, and this is great talking with you, Andrew, because I rarely have people to bounce things off of, and I really respect your thoughts on things. It is a powerful experience to see these with your own eyes. In fact, when I had patients, in my clinical years, the first thing I do on an initial visit is I'd show them their blood under the screen. And we'd be based on what I saw on the terrain, which I, with an educated eye would understand, things that are the source of their issues. We would key in on those, and we would see these morphological changes right before their eyes, virtual shape shifting of one creature into another just within moments. And one of the techniques that I always used, because, if you think about terrain medicine, you're talking about a condition in the environment that will then trigger the necessary changes in order to create those, normal equalizing effects that the body as a self-maintaining, self-correcting organism, triggers into effect in order to heal itself. And so, with the original German school, we understood that there are different families of protids or somatids. And for instance, if you have a strep throat, and you culture streptococcus, what you're really talking about is a seed, that we recognize as penicillin notatum that then differentiates through different phases of activity into an eventual bacterial phase that we call, streptococcus, could be staphylococcus, but we actually know which, families these belong to and what they differentiate from. So when I looked at blood, what I did is I prepared at least a dozen slides, and understanding that the blood would have the environmental conditions that would then trigger certain families to progress in certain ways. And what I do is with each different blood slide is I'd subject it to an isopathic solution of the actual protids from different families. Could be aspergillus, mucor, notatum, penicillin frequentans, any number of things. And then if those particular slides showed byproducts of what we knew were associated with a particular family, then we could make, again, a good assumption that the environmental conditions were triggering the progression of that particular organism, and therefore certain needs were necessary, which would suggest certain conditions in the body that then we could go ahead and treat. For an example, if you put that developer, so-called on the cell, and you see a bunch of fibrin pop out, then you knew that you're probably looking at, an environmental condition that needed the preponderance of mucorracimosis, which would, put out those kind of fibrin elements that, would, help in the whole blood clotting mechanism and do a number of things that mucor is associated for as far as a functional organism in the body. The flip side to that is when a body has gone south far enough, then those triggering mechanisms or those pleomorphic progressions get hung on a biological plateau. And in other words, they may lack the resources or be impeded in some way, even with pharmaceutical drugs or so forth, that are not allowing it to do its full function. So they stay at that biological plateau for an extended period, and then that level of cyclogeny actually becomes problematic. So then we would, do measures that would, kick the body off that plateau by providing all the resources it needed to go full circle, and then at the same time provide the protid variety that would, you see them under a microscope just kind of swim up and explode the higher valences, and then at the same time reseed with the seed organisms, which is actually a real form of immunization. You could think of it that way. So there's a whole branch of medicine there that should really be looked at by the conventional system. And then of course people that experience that and practice it at a high level, you see conditions readily resolving themselves, not because you're curing a disease or even trying to treat a disease in the first place, but just like a farmer, you realize it's all about the ecosystem. And the most important thing about the ecosystem is managing the microbial populations. So anyway, that's, I guess, more of a statement than anything. But any thoughts on any of that?
Yeah, Bear, that's really fascinating. And, I'd like to learn more about how that test works and what is the extent of the information that you can glean from it. But it's really fascinating that you brought up the example of Mucor, because I used to work in cancer medicine earlier in my career. And basically all of the patients I was working in an inpatient setting in the hospital, were treated with chemotherapy, high dose chemotherapy, because I was working mostly with people with acute leukemia. And so their immune system and various other parts of their body were extremely damaged from the chemotherapy drugs, right? We all know that you stop growing hair, your hair falls out, right? That's because it's toxic to the hair follicles and many other parts of the body as well. And in that state, there would be times when Mucor would be called upon, and it would generally go into the sinus area and cause that an infection there. And it probably was stuck, as you mentioned, because the terrain was so damaged from the chemotherapeutic drugs, and they also were probably given prophylactic antifungals, like fluconazole. And so the Mucor was, if you detected it in a patient, it was like an extreme emergency. Like you had to call the surgeon like within minutes, because if it was left to go, it would basically eat up your face. It's a really scary thing. I remember the first time there was a possibility of this in a patient, and I didn't quite react fast enough because I was really unfamiliar, and I got a stern talking to. So if the terrain is so damaged, from these toxic exposures, then really our pleomorphic recycling system is not able to function properly, and it goes out of whack like you described. But then the medical establishment blames the organism for causing the problem instead of looking at the real cause.
Yeah, and the Mucor, as we mentioned, one of its jobs is to play a role in the whole thrombocyte blood clotting mechanism in the body. But when it goes to one of those higher valences and gets on that biological plateau that we're describing, then you have a preponderance of that fibrin material that it makes, and it makes the blood overly viscous. That severely compromises blood circulation. It agglutinates the blood cells. And, one of the best remedies of all for people that are worried about blood clots and strokes and all those sorts of things, instead of taking baby aspirin, if they took or something worse, rat poison, for instance, then that we call, So anyway, if you took the proteid variety of Mucor, it would automatically neutralize that and return the viscosity of the blood to normal. And you get a wonderful immunomodulation effect at the same time. But any of these organisms can create great problems. Aspergillosis is going to create similar effects, in the lungs and in the lymphatic system, by way of what it normally does functionally. But if it gets overstaying its welcome on a certain valence, then, you have equal problems, just like you might have a problem with staphylococcus. It won't go away. Same thing. And of course, a lot of these preparations, some doctors were starting to catch on that, wow, these are better than antibiotics, and they started using things like preparations of notatum and so forth, and get good effects. But now it's hard to find in the country. They shut down all the distribution channels. Right.
What's ironic, Bear, is I just got an email from Symbiopathic, which is still right. And I don't know. I don't know if that's illegal or not in the States, but I got on that, and so those are actual isopaths, right, and stuff that you can get still.
Yeah, those are they sell in the drop form, which is the weakest solution. that you can get, but they're good because at home you can use them and not get yourself in any problems. Capsule form are the next strength up, suppositories are the next, and best ones for clinical situations where you want real quick results. You want to have injectables, and those are the first ones they got rid of as far as being able to get them in the country here.
So when you're saying injectables, are you talking injecting into the blood or how does that work?
I am deep intramuscular injection is we found the most effective in clinical.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah. So, with going back to the virus thing, we look at the classical pictures of viruses, right? And you see Ebola virus, which is like a little snake looking thing. You see all these different pictures they have. And of course, we talk about how these are mostly graphic interpretations from what they're seeing with the electron microscope. But Andy, what do you think, Andrew, in terms of your theories on these different images?
Yeah, well, I haven't specifically looked at Ebola, but if you look at the viruses that have been isolated from lower single-celled organisms like amoeba or algae or bacteria, and by the way, in those papers, they actually did successfully isolate these particles and purify them through a standard technique where you just take the culture of the microorganisms that you suspect there are viral particles, and you filter them through a small membrane because the particles are much smaller than the cells. And then you can use a density gradient centrifuge to put them all together in a tight band that you can easily take out and look under the microscope. And there's an excellent article on Stanford University website where you can see lots of pictures of these actually. And they have very unique geometric shapes and structures. And that are unmistakable. Like as soon as you see this, you know exactly what it is if you've seen it already. And actually, some of them are quite beautiful. The viruses that I've seen that are alleged to be human are all basically just circular vesicles, which have indistinguishable appearance from exosomes. So I'd have to look at Ebola specifically, but Ebola is kind of another big subject that we could talk about, but I don't think it's real either.
Yeah, we're getting back to language again in some respects too, and what they define things as.
One thing I've heard about Ebola is that the symptoms that people were experiencing that were attributed to Ebola were actually created by formaldehyde being deliberately put in water supplies in Africa. Have you ever heard that?
No, but that's certainly the kind of thing that could, cause lots of health problems.
Yeah,
I mean, if we look at polio, there's so many interesting things about polio, and I definitely recommend the book "The Moth and the Iron Lung" by Forrest Moretti, where he goes into this in detail. But the polio outbreaks occurred in the summer, and it coincided with this invasive moth species called the gypsy moth, which was decimating the plants and many of the summer crops in New England. And they began using a untested pesticide called lead arsenate. And this was used pretty much indiscriminately. And people, didn't use any protective equipment or even gloves, and they were dousing this all over their summer fruits and vegetable crops, as well as trees. And they had, whole families would go out and douse everything with this stuff. It was like a big activity. And lo and behold, like the same time of year when this activity was going on was when you'd start to see the annual polio cases. And poliomyelitis, by the way, doesn't refer to a virus. It refers to a specific disease of the spinal cord that has a very characteristic lesion when looked at under the microscope. And there's really never been any proof that any virus causes this. And it pretty much went away right after these toxic pesticides stopped being used widely. And at the end of the epidemic of polio, actually, they switched from lead arsenate to DDT. And the clinical characteristics of the illness also changed during that time period, but were still largely neurologic in nature. And then after DDT was taken out of widespread use, basically the cases went back down and almost disappeared. And that was a couple of years before the Sabin vaccine was available.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
I mean, basically, it was like
And that,
another form of meningitis, right? And they just reclassify these things and call it something new, and then they put it in their books that the doctors then have to. It's a language thing, then they have to call it that. Go ahead, Bear.
But that opens up the next important part of the germ theory discussion: is how do you account for epidemics? I grew up in the polio generation, and actually, had a friend with an affected arm. And, what I've learned since, of course, is that when you have a herd exposure to a toxin, as you're suggesting, then you will have a pandemic of internal reactions in people's bodies that are going to try to get rid of this organism or this toxin, I should say. And you can also go deeper into energetic issues that are recognized in, for instance, disciplines of homeopathy, where they bring up ideas of miasm and things that are working on other levels that similarly create conditions where entire races of people, let alone populations of people, will be prone to holographically, let's just say, mirroring conditions in their biology relative to things that are going on other levels. And then that, of course, gets into other things we can talk about, like New German medicine, that took it to a more of an evidence-based understanding of what's going on that level. So that's the biggest question I get all the time is, well, how do you account for the fact that everybody's getting this, or that I was just talking to Mike yesterday, he had a sore throat, and I woke up with a sore throat today.
Can I say one thing real quick? Because I've been researching a lot, and Andrew, I know, I would assume you're probably aware with your psych. You went to school and you're an MD as a psychiatrist, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so in the 70s, this became big with psi research, and I don't know if you're familiar. This was in the early 2000s, I believe. It's psychologist Roger Nelson. And he worked with Dean Radin too, and he created what was called the Global Consciousness Project, and they worked with random number generators, and what they found is that there was a deep connection between all human consciousness in affecting these random number generators, and it relates to quantum mechanics, and and how location doesn't matter. And what they're finding, and they're showing these in these, hard science studies, is that human consciousness is connected, and we can actually fundamentally change different aspects of reality just with our consciousness. So if we're talking about, and what they did with these studies, they did a really cool one at Burning Man, which is close to my heart, where they took these random number generators, which were, there's a number of different types, which are built so that they're very, very random, and they have a specific randomization, like 25% or something like that. And then they went to Burning Man with these, and what their theory is that in Burning Man, at the end of the event, the week-long event, they'd have the famous burning of the man. It's a tall wooden statue that they burn, and everybody comes together, and it's a big kind of group experience. And their theory was that these random number generators would be affected by all of these people in one place. It was like 20,000 people or more, 60,000 people at Burning Man, and that they would see spikes. And so, of course, they did the test, and they found that there was definitely a very large degree of change. That was something like 1 in some 100 million chance of this happening, or something like that, that Dean Radin was able to quantify. And they actually did this 3 years in a row, where they found the same effect. And this study has been done in major universities across the country and the world. And so my point of bringing this up with contagion is that if we have large global events happening where we now are all connected on the internet and connected on multimedia and with the news outlets and stuff, pushing these concepts, and with what we know, with what Bear was just bringing up with New German medicine and the way that our physiology works with pleomorphism, it makes sense that this type of contagion could come with where we see these physiological effects from specifically our consciousness manifesting this as a group.
Yeah, Mike, this is a really interesting idea, and you're reminding me of several other events or research that also talk about this. One thing is that the Transcendental Meditation Organization, they had an event where they gathered, as many meditators as they could to Washington, D.C., and I think they had a couple of thousand people.
Yes.
And they all meditated at the same time with an intention of peace. And what happened for a few days is that the crime rate dropped substantially.
Yes.
Right. So through their conscious intention, they had an effect on other people. Now that was done in one geographic area, right? So not remotely. But then there's also research from Rupert Sheldrake, who has talked a lot about scientific studies that don't fit with the main scientific paradigms of the 20th century. And this experiment was done where he had a group of subjects, and they were supposed to identify, I think, 4 people that they knew who could live anywhere in the world. And those people were all notified by the whoever was conducting the experiment. I think this was Sheldrake's own work. And they picked a time, and the test subject was told that you were going to receive an email from one of these 4 people at this specified time. So 5 minutes before, you're going to get an email asking you to predict who's going to call or email. So what they did is that they contacted the person 10 minutes in advance and said, you're the one who's going to send this email this morning. So they were already thinking about it. And then after they were thinking about it and had that intention, the person was able to predict with a pretty robust accuracy who was going to be well above chance, who was going to be sending the email. And what they found is that the geographic proximity was no factor at all. So if they were on the other side of the world, they'd be just as likely to be predicted. But the one factor that did predict the accuracy rate was actually how close they were to each other on a sort of emotional relationship level. And the closer they were, the more likely the test subject was to get the correct answer. So, and then you also have things like remote viewing, where people, and this was done actually under the government's funding through a special research building at Stanford University for a long time. There's still a lot of people doing this and teaching this technique, where you would basically learn this skill where you would be able to see someone somewhere in the world and view their surroundings, where their location is, what's going on, almost as if you're seeing it through their eyes. And this was turned out to be quite accurate in many cases, and not 100% and not always, but they used this technique, for example, to locate an airplane that crashed in the jungle in Africa that was like a needle in a haystack to find. And they had remote viewer who was looking at maps of the general region, which was, hundreds of square miles. And they were able to focus in on it, and they were able to locate the fallen plane. And there are many other examples like that are in the, Freedom of Information Act disclosures or from accounts of the participants in the program. So you can combine all these things with the social science research also that looks into, social contagion, where, like you're with a group of people and someone yawns and then all these other people start yawning, or how women have their menstrual cycles synchronize when they develop close relationships. And we don't really, fully understand from a scientific experimental perspective the mechanism by which this kind of communication occurs, but it totally makes sense if you think about how humans operate. We are social creatures, we live in communities, and it's imperative that we exchange information about our environment with each other in order to be prepared to face changing environmental conditions.
Well, yeah. I was going to say, too, it reminds me of the thing with the dogs, even with that famous video where the dog knew the owner was coming back. I don't know if you ever saw that, but the owner, he put a camera on his dog, and he would be, miles and miles away heading home, and then the dog would come to the door waiting for him. And there was an energetic informational field going between even the dog and his owner. So I think, this is what we talk about a lot, and Bear can chime in on this idea of informational fields tying into our DNA and all this, and that there's just so much more than the reductionist materialists really are apt to acknowledge.
I think the missing link in all this is Walter Russell, because he's the best person that I know of that really created a whole understanding of how waveform mechanics works, and that in fact this whole simulation that we think of as our lives and our bodies is a byproduct of that. And all of the, you were talking about remote viewing, Andrew. And if we just think about it, well, you and I are remote viewing right now, and it's done through a technology as we think of it. Of course, we believe it's real because I have a physical box sitting on my desk, but we're the ones that conceived that in the first place. And what is bringing you to my desktop? They're informational fields, they're waveforms, that's all it is. Now, compared to this box that I'm looking at, the human potential is infinitely more extensive and more capable. And so maybe these technologies are actually telling us that we don't even need the box in the first place. And in fact, they're just little training wheels or stepping stones, so to speak, to get us to the point where we can throw away our cell phones and computers and just transmit these informational fields firsthand without the intermediary technology, which is actually quite crude compared to ourselves.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing to think about, Bear, that, we have all these abilities that we haven't really acknowledged or recognized in ourselves. And I wonder how much of the, sort of way that we grew up under mind control programming and, drinking fluoridated water and things like that have really impaired our ability to realize fully our potential in this realm.
Yeah, we're talking about digital versus analog once again, too, and how the digital mechanism is constantly being pushed on us right now, because that is literally a bastardization of reality, right? It's breaking up reality into an incomplete waveform, where the analog waveform is all the little nuance that is there. And that is the true future that we talk about a lot, is going back to this analog technology, where it's the actual real reality versus the simulacrum, which is what digital is, which is what, there's not saying that digital is completely bad. I mean, we're using digital technology to talk right now, but there is a weirdness to digital that isn't natural. And I don't know if you're familiar with I don't know if he was a doctor, but Robert Monroe, in the 60s and 70s, who did a lot of exploration into out-of-body and remote viewing. And he actually has the Monroe Institute, where you can go and learn this stuff. I believe it's in Virginia. I read his book and I've been following it. And so one thing that if people out there really want to start getting deeper into this, you can experiment with yourself. You can teach yourself how to do this stuff and have these experiences and do your own scientific experiments in these other, with these realms or whatever you want to call them, and start working on your dream state and leaving your body and doing this stuff yourself, and start validating these concepts, because it'll open up. We need to be our own investigators, and we need to be doing this ourselves so that we can start pushing the boundaries, because it seems to me that the digital state that we're moving towards is not going to do it. And science, there are some amazing people in science that are pushing these boundaries and doing this, but they're also, as we've been discussing today, are very restricted in their materialism and their reductionist mindset. And so they're missing, as Bear says a lot, the other half of the equation. So we can do this ourselves, though. And one of these things I highly recommend checking out Robert Monroe. He's passed away, but his institute and what they're doing, because they're doing amazing work in healing and science and all this stuff in terms of what you're talking about, Andrew, and with the out-of-body stuff, because I feel like that's a major missing point to what science should be looking at, and kind of delving more into this analog space of reality and the powers that we have to really start moving towards that direction, because that's where we need to be going. The digital realm, that the other side that they're pushing us towards, is only going to continue to move towards this kind of transhumanistic agenda or whatever that's going to take away from our ability as divine spark to really forge a path towards freedom and awareness and true health and reality that we know is something that is amazing and something we all, I think, want to see. That's my spill. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's really true. I mean, that there's so much more that we're capable of that we really don't realize. And, you know, there's so many ways that this has been sort of changed in terms of our common understanding of the meaning. Like even something like magic, for example. I think magic traditionally was really referring to a sort of alchemical process where we can transmute ourselves into something better by going through the process of change, and that sometimes that can reveal properties that are, you know, beyond the mundane. And now this has been reformulated to mean sleight of hand or trickery, right? Which may be related to Mercury, actually. But it takes us further away from realizing our full capacity. And, you know, that's really unfortunate because, you know, I don't know what the limits are myself because I haven't developed this enough personally to have these experiences, but I imagine that the limits are quite high.
Yeah.
And the original scientists were alchemists, if you go back a little ways, and chemistry was a bastardization of that. And the original alchemists, of course, looked at things introspectively first and then extrapolated into empirical observation to see the results of what was going on internally. And the reductionist, revisionist, agenda, whatever you want to call it, took that whole inside, introspection out and externalized everything. So now we're caught 100% in the Maya of after effects. And when you go back to waveform mechanics, that's very understandable more. And it becomes a lot less abstract in that the whole mechanics of how those electrical vectors create this simulation in the first place. So I think what we are having is an alchemical resurgence. And that's why I see out there a lot of people are starting to talk about spagyricism and, spagyric medicines. And I've used those, for many years in my practice, and they just work better because the whole process allows you to get the complete full spectrum informational fields from all levels of the reality of a botanical specimen. But the alchemists knew that wasn't just a manner or a method to create herbal tinctures. It was a whole model for life and what we're doing here on this planet in the first place, which is, externalizing ourselves for introspection and looking at the parts and then purifying the parts and putting them back together into an elevated whole on the return journey. And, it's encouraging to me because I do see a renaissance of that sort of thinking coming back, but now in a more refined level, in that the mysticism, that I had to learn in Chinese medicine, for instance, that was based on metaphoric terminology from different cultures, and then reading, old school books on alchemy, that were kind of guarded and had a lot of mysticism. Now it's all out in the open and it's just pure science. And I think what it's causing is a reconciliation between the two hemispheres, our right and left brain, and unifying them, or maybe better saying, a unification of our heart and mind so that we're not just caught in one level of reality.
Yeah, there's a great image that I shared with you, Bear, last year of from the 1600s of an alchemist's laboratory. And it's very fascinating to see just how cool it was, but just how the interjection of sound and audio also into this. And, we had Sherry Edwards on recently, and she's a master, the world-class audio healer, sound healer. She's very unique in her ability, what she hears. But once again, this was an analog technology that they integrated in with plants and with other things. And there was just a higher understanding of a lot of these aspects that we've delineated from because of our schooling, and we're not learning about real history and real science, and everything is digitized. The chemistry, I would say, even is like a digital variation of alchemy, right? Where they're just taking the constituents and the pieces in the same way in a digital piece of music, they take the pieces, or in digital codes, the ones and zeros versus the full wave. And you look back at this lab, and I know this is something that we're focusing on you building out, is your new lab, where we can take some of these technologies and interface them with Walter Russell and create kind of an institute where we're exploring these new concepts of science in a way that can really be powerful. And who knows, maybe invent things where we can leave our body and come together in another field, if you will, and do some healing together, or explore. You talked about bringing out your, with Sherry Edwards technology, a sound healing room and stuff, and integrating that with spagyrics in a way. I mean, these are really fun things that we can look into, right? And kind of mess around as the new type of alchemist.
Yeah, well, we discussed on our show with Sherry, she came out, her and I got together in my old clinic in Hawaii back in, maybe the mid 90s. And, she hadn't quite developed all her technologies at that point. But what we did develop were sound generators and the ability to analyze a person's voice and then isolate those sound frequencies that we could discern from a voice recording that would then change in a person's entire physiology. So with my work with her, we did construct a very sophisticated sound room. Now we can do even better. And of course, one of the things we're doing, in addition to developing a whole new farm and a new location here, is setting up a laboratory for, a lot more advanced levels of investigation and manufacturing of next level plant medicines, but also a separate building that I already have the blueprints for. I've written them up years ago, that would create, a whole acoustic room that would go way beyond what I was able to do in my clinic all those years back. Sound frequencies, of course, are exactly what Walter Russell is talking about. Sound is one of 18 dimensions on a waveform. And again, those are the electrical vectors coming exactly from our consciousness. So another level, Andrew, that, we're talking about techniques in bioterrain medicine. We don't confine ourselves these days just to biological remedies and looking at microbes, but we can measure firsthand with instruments, the analyze all these dimensions along a waveform that Walter Russell talked about, and all the increments within each of those 18 dimensions, find out where the distortions are. We know why those distortions are there. That's another story. And then use all manner of modality, including the direct broadcasting of frequencies, to bring symmetry back and then watch physiology change. So that's where we're going. That's where we should be. And Walter Russell accurately described the age that we're now in, that we should be calling it the age of transmutation, because we no longer, like the alchemists knew back then, but didn't, maybe have the abilities that we have now. They knew that it was an inside job, but now we have a technological assistance. Of course, the technology that we're using is not seducing us into more of an external situation where we think, oh, that's where the answer is. But no, we created that in the first place, so we can use it as a tool, but not rely on it. And so that's my spiel. But Andrew, I know you're also interested in farming, and I would just finish by saying this: if anybody really wants to learn true alchemy, you become a farmer. And right now we're in the midst of planting season, and I'm looking outside, and I was outside all day yesterday, just planting new herbs and preparing new growing grounds, and we're seeing things that from last year are flourishing even better this year. And, when you just on a day-to-day basis are surrounded in nature and watching things grow and working with the plants, you have a palpable interaction between yourself and those life forms. And you really get to experience firsthand, with no doubt left in your mind, that there is a real communication there that exists between all of life.
Yeah, well, and that's even been shown with conventional scientific study, and I am familiar with Eileen McCusick's work, who she calls it biofield tuning, but she's also working with sound emanations from our body, and she uses tuning forks to find where there's a disturbance in the resonance. And it also reminded me of the experiment, and this is very accessible for people. You can find a YouTube video of this where you have a group of pendulums on a table, right? And you start them all off, and you could do this, 20 or 25 pendulums. And you start them off swinging back and forth at different intervals, and watch them over time, and you'll see that they all synchronize, right? And because these pressure waves somehow get in phase with each other and affect the motion of the pendulum. And it's really incredible to watch. Because it's not something, it appears to be like magic, right? Because you don't fully understand the mechanism. And it's quite likely that our bodies can work in this way as well. And I think that's kind of what you're getting at a simplistic level. And the technology can be a double-edged sword. It can be used for sinister purposes. And I'll give you the example of television. Obviously, we know there's a lot of negative things about television, but if you look at the original patents, you'll see that they specify a specific refresh rate of the images, right, which is essentially a vibration. And that vibratory frequency tends to influence our own brainwaves, vibrational frequency, and puts us into what in an EEG terminology, like electroencephalography, would be alpha waves. And we know that when the brain is in an alpha wave state, we're much more suggestible and open to new information. So the television essentially uses the same kind of technology to put us in that brain state, where then whatever information that they're putting out in the television content, we will take in and accept we'll be much more likely to accept than if we're in a different brain state. So it's very fascinating stuff. But
that's why we call Alfa Vedic. That's why we came up with that, because we're suggesting new ways of medicine into your brain. So that was part of the stimulus behind our name, actually. But yeah, we talk about that. TV programming is called programming for a reason, huh?
Yeah, absolutely. Language is a very important thing to pay special attention to. I mean, even the word germ, for example, right, which most people think of as a dangerous microorganism, the word originally means a new growth or budding, right, like a germ cell or
this drove Bishop crazy, because he was like, why are they calling it? I'm in the Ethel de Hume book, she talks about it, how it just drove him crazy that he's like, they're so bad they even named their thing the wrong way, because it's a budding or growth, as you're going to say. Sorry to interrupt, but that's just so funny. It's just such an inversion.
Yeah, well, so many words are like that. Really, really they are. I mean, the same thing could be thought of as virus and exosome, if they are in fact the same thing. The virus means poison, and it may actually be something that helps us be saved from a poison.
Isn't that crazy? Well, one thing we talked about before the show started, and I know this is something that Bear it fits into this, is Andrew, you've been very one of your goals right now, one of the things you're working on is helping kids and stuff that have been vaccine damaged. And I argue oftentimes that most of our ills from the last 100 years, in terms of all these new quote unquote diseases, are literally coming from the vaccines and from man's messing with our nature by injecting stuff into us. It's kind of this Frankenstein science, but obviously we're seeing effects everywhere, and trying to mitigate those effects is a very admirable job to do. And I know, Dr. Lando, Bear's had a lot of experience with that, and Bear, maybe you want to go a little bit into what you've done in the past, and then Andrew, would love to hear what you're kind of working on.
Yeah, please.
Sure. Unfortunately, there's not a recipe in terrain medicine. The first thing you learn is everybody is unique and has different needs. So you have to way to assess on the ground not only what those needs are, but you have to be able to prioritize them, and you have to do things in proper sequence. Just like if you're out on a construction site, if you don't do things in proper order, it's just not going to come out that good. So, there are certain things that I know in naturopathic circles people use, like thuya, it's different spagyric or homeopathic preparations of it that are known to be effective in leaching out some of the remnants of, the toxic elements within vaccines. But there's so many different things in vaccines right now, and always have been actually, that it requires a lot of measures on different levels. So in the past, I did see quite a few people with kids that were vaccine damaged. So the first thing we do is put them on a bioterrain program, and that would require us to do labs, hands-on assessment, and measures with clinical kinesiology and a number of other things we employ. Traditional Chinese medicine, just discerning, the state of their body through their pulses and all that manner of things. And based on that, we would be able to find out exactly what we needed to do in that body. And first off, you'd have to find, where in their body they might be challenged as far as their emunctory or drainage channels being compromised. With some people, you might have to, work on liver channels or kidney channels, respiratory, so that they could be more efficient in eliminating these things. And then depending on, what organ system you're working on, then there's a myriad of ways that you can interact just on that one organism or organ system that's different from individual to individual. So you really have to have a way to be able to assess these things and do them properly. And then we'd also back it up with a lot of hands-on techniques that would, allow like a retraining of the nervous system, because what you've really done is you've interrupted the communication channels within the neurology itself. So a lot of times that would have to be retrained, and sometimes just with simple repetitive movements to reinstate the normal patterns, the way the nervous system normally works. For instance, when you walk, you have kind of a cross crawls pattern, and that's why when we're infants, we crawl before we can walk, because we're in training all these patterns. So it's very necessary most of the time, especially with kids, to take them back to ground zero and retrain them just like they're infants. And we have a lot of techniques physically to help do that while we're working on their terrain and chelating different heavy metals out. There's all sorts of ways depending on the metals involved, and there's a lot of heavy metals that are contained in those vaccines. And then also using homeopathics and spagyrics to put in new informational fields that will repattern them on different levels, back to the original primal patterns before they had other things interjected in there that are, taking over the machinery. So any thoughts so far?
Yeah, well, I'm curious because I think the predominant metal that's pervasive in vaccines is aluminum, and it's in the form of a sort of nanoparticulate aluminum hydroxide powder. So, well, what specific like spagyrics or chelators do you think would work best in that situation?
Well, the first thing is to pay attention, as I already mentioned, to the normal drainage channels, because the body is typically capable of getting rid of anything on its own. Now, if it's really compromised, after still and needs extra help after those channels are open, and if the testing reveals you need to take extra measures, then you might do certain chelation procedures. Certain metals like aluminum, you might use, EDTA and things. In the old days, we used to rely more on IV drips and of chelation therapies. Over the years, I've kind of come to the conclusion that's a little more invasive and a little bit harsh. And I didn't do as much in later years, because with more sophisticated terrain measures coupled with just using real intense concentrates from green foods like algae and, chlorella and cilantro. And, we get very strong 100-to-1 concentrates, for instance, that are really good at binding up with particular metals and getting those things out. And you might do a hair analysis that shows that, okay, there's a preponderance of aluminum, but then when you do your bioterrain protocols, you might find, well, in actuality, there's another metal that you have to pay attention to, get it out with a different measure than maybe you'd use for aluminum. And then that is, the sequential key in order for the body to get rid of the aluminum in the first place. And it might just be able to get rid of the rest of it on its own. So it goes back to really being able to treat an individual, as an individual.
Interesting. What do you think are the different, would someone who has more of a nervous system problem versus someone who maybe has an intestinal problem or a joint problem, would that give you information about the specific nature of the underlying condition?
Yeah, it would absolutely do that. But also you and I, for instance, can be subjected to the same toxin. And depending on our idiosyncrasies and our vulnerabilities that are unique to us, you might develop a digestive problem and I might develop a neurological degenerative issue. So the same thing can create different things in different people. It's all about how we react to things. For instance, another type of testing we do is metabolic typing. And what we understand is that based on if a person is a slow oxidizer, fast oxidizer, if they're parasympathetic is dominant over the sympathetic, or any number of imbalances that could happen, we're going to react much differently to the same substance or even food. You can take food, for instance, and people say, oh, you need to eat alkaline foods. And, there's some wisdom to that. On the other hand, I could eat a particular alkaline food, and it might actually make me acidic depending on my unique chemistry and my reaction to it, compared to, it might shift you in an alkaline position, and Mike, it just might be neutral. So one of the main labs we do in, with everybody, including vaccine damaged people, is ionization analysis, where we understand it's not so much the chemistry, it's the electrical properties of the body that have to be managed. And just like in waveform physics, when I use a dual impedance antenna to discern from the, primal waveforms where their polarities are asymmetrical, whether it's a horizontal east-west or a north-south polarity, and then we can then understand based on where the distortions are. What you're talking about is a vector of electricity that's distorting, the waveform, and all our body is a composite of a myriad of waveforms, and then you can, measure the whole composite. So with that technology, you can discern where the distortions are, where your therapies need to lie in order to bring the electrical vectors back into symmetry. So with the ionization analysis, which is a lab assay of certain biochemical elements, then we put that in a mathematical equation, and we can see the proportions of these elements one to another and know how they're being managed in the body. So that tells you, what different organ systems are doing. But more importantly, it tells you exactly where the vectors of electrical forces are distorted, just like, the dual impedance analysis. And then through that, we use chemistry in order to change the electricity. So instead of looking at alkalinity or acidity, we're looking at it more of a cationic, anionic level as far as resistance and the speed of electricity, its velocity. We're looking at the other elements that play into it, because they will create the conductivity that will, create the magnitude that's going to amplify problems. And so you keep going back to, this is an electrical problem. So going back to helping the body chelate something out, or to bring it back into balance in some other way, you're going to cut a lot of corners by going to that primal electrical system, managing the distortions at that level. And what's nice about it is you get the solution from step one, because you're just looking where everything emanates from in the first place. And then all your modalities that you use, that you secondarily test to see what brings the symmetries back, then that tells you all the things that we as doctors are trained to, be more obsessive about. And that is, okay, what organ systems are compromised, and, what things on the ground are we, needing to manage, but you're not reverse engineering from those external after effects. You're in turn going from the top down with the solution first, and knowing exactly what you need to use in order to create the changes you want, and at the same time understanding how those effects from the top have created what you're seeing in the body. So that probably doesn't really answer your question really concisely, but that's the methodology. And it's a whole different inversion of what all of us are taught in conventional medicine, naturopathy. It doesn't matter. We're all in the same box trying to reverse engineer from after effects that the alchemists of old would have said, what the heck are you doing? You're caught in the Maya, and you're not even understanding where things come from in the first place. Now we have ways to do that.
Wow, that's really fascinating approach, and seems very elegant in terms of a method. I think conventional medicine almost completely ignores the electromagnetic aspects of our body. And, they certainly do talk about it, like we have, EKGs and EEGs and EMGs, right, which are just for diagnostic purposes. And then they certainly teach us about things like action potentials and nerve cells, and, surface membrane potential for all different cells. But they never really develop that into a physiological explanation. And they never talk about any therapeutic ways to use electromagnetism to help with any underlying condition. It's almost like they just focus on the chemistry only, and as if it's just like there's a correlate, that's, oh yeah, there's electrical properties, but they don't really mean anything. Kind of that result just from ions flowing and things like that. But there's a whole other world to this, and it's something that I really need to learn a lot more about. And it's really exciting, all the possibilities that are presented, from this kind of approach.
Yeah, Michael.
Well, we're looking.
Go ahead, Bear.
Well, I was just going to say real quick, we're trained as doctors to look at all the fractured parts on the ground. And so our mindset and our whole, perspective is fractured. It's just going off in all different directions. And you correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in psychiatry, they have a diagnostic label for that.
They have one for virtually everything. And
well, when you're fragmented off in different personalities, I think they call it schizophrenia.
Schizophrenia does literally mean split personality, but that's not what they use to describe that condition. I think you're talking about dissociative identity disorder, which is like multiple personality disorder used to be the name for it. But yeah, it is a fracturing of the personality, so to speak. But how they come up with the psychiatric diagnoses that are in the manual is they basically just make them up out of thin air. Like they have some doctors get together and they say, have you seen any patients with this, constellation of issues? And they say, yeah, I've seen that. And then they say, well, what are the issues? A, B, C, and D, and E, F, and G. And then they say, all right, let's create a new label for this and a new disorder. And each version of the DSM is the book where they list all these. It's called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. There's no statistics in it, by the way. And each version that comes out, there's like an exponential expansion of the number of diagnoses. So you could virtually label anyone with something from there, probably multiple different things.
Yeah, so germ theory denier will be in there soon, I'm sure.
Yeah, well, that would be a delusional disorder, probably. Or they could definitely have, because delusional disorder has these subtypes of specific type of delusions, and a delusion is defined as a fixed false belief. So, most commonly you might hear about people who, have a delusion that, everyone is spies working for the Russian government, and, that we have to take them out or else we're going to be in grave danger, things like that. So they have these different categories, like there's like the jealous type, so people who always feel that their partner is always cheating on them, even if there's no evidence to back it up. There's the somatic type where people might believe that they're pregnant. For example, I had a patient like this who was in her 60s and had believed she was pregnant for 20 years. And it was really fascinating because I said, well, how come you haven't delivered the baby yet? And she said, well, I saw this advertisement for the blood pressure medicine that I was taking, and it said it could result in prolonged labor. So that's why I haven't delivered yet. And it's been prolonged for 20 years. So, so people with these kind of fixed beliefs are very, very rigid. And so they could have a category of, conspiracy type delusions. I could see them putting that in there.
Yeah. And we could relate this back to the out of body stuff, and this can go back to more spiritual stuff, but how we have potentially past lives and all these other ramifications for these delusions, right? And I mean, it's just, there's so much that, mainstream doesn't get into in terms of the electrical, but also in terms of consciousness. And, one thing that I'm seeing is there seems to be a certain type of individual that sees through the veil and can see what's going on in terms of the control matrix and how the tricks that are being played to control society. And then there's the other flip side of people that are very much react in a way where they look to those people who see in that way as crazy or quote unquote conspiracy theorists, etc. And my new theory is that, because I've always seen it since I was a little kid, and I know Bear's probably been the same way, and it sounds like you too, Andrew, very much easily see through the veil. And I think this could relate to beyond an epigenetic concept, but to literally the bloodline that you're from, or that your past lives, that you come from a specific bloodline that has a specific genetic strain or whatever we want to call it, that harks back to Atlantis or whatever, and that we have this distant memory of knowledge, and where there's other bloodlines that people come in that maybe don't have that heritage of understanding. And so it's harder for them to see through the veil, and they're a little bit easier controlled in that sense. And I've been doing a lot of research into these bloodlines and stuff, and it's, it is really some fascinating rabbit holes that you can go down. But that's a theory that I'm kind of been working on in terms of, how there seems to be some individuals that can very easily not get caught up in the matrix, while others seem to be very much caught up in it. I don't know. Just throwing that out there.
No, it's really good, because I've definitely put a lot of thought into this, because, we've all had the experience, right? That once we see through the veil and start looking at the true nature of what's going on in our world, from a metaphysical, spiritual level, and also from a historical and current events, political level, it's very difficult to then have relationships with people who are still stuck in the matrix paradigm. And, and then once you see the truth and you realize that the people that you thought may be your benefactor are actually, manipulating you or doing harm to you, then you want everyone else to be able to see that too, not just for the selfish reason of that you want to be able to still talk to your friends or family, but also because, you want to save us from the plight of, being fully controlled, which is clearly where things are heading at the moment. And so, I think you start off thinking, well, if I use the right language, the right approach, the right technique, maybe I could open up someone to this material. But the more I have, personal experience and also talk to other people about their attempts at doing this, what I find is that some people are just completely closed off to this for whatever reason. And I don't know if it's through a bloodline, but certainly if I am part of this bloodline, it has not been expressed in the other members of my family in this bloodline. But nevertheless, it's, so my friend James True talks about this in terms of an aperture. and that basically the aperture has to be open beyond a threshold in order for someone to be receptive to information that contradicts the mainstream ideas and culture. And so when I've been speaking out publicly lately, I've been taking this into account, and I don't expect that anyone who's totally closed off is really going to listen to what I say. They'll probably just turn it off if they come across it. But there are those people who their aperture is open just a little bit, just enough. And what's going on now, some of the policies are just so blatantly obvious against the mainstream narrative, like, about healthcare workers being laid off and hospitals being empty, right? How can you take that knowledge in and not realize that it's the opposite, the exact opposite of what you'd expect if there was the most, serious pandemic in 100 years? And so if you don't realize from that observation that something is fishy, then you're not going to realize it, even if the government made an announcement that said, yes, we tricked you. You're going to say, oh, that's just a practical joke.
Exactly.
But those people whose aperture is open just enough to see these obvious contradictions and say, something is fishy here, that's the person that I want to be able to reach, because they could take that's fishy to understanding the whole ball of wax, and then they would be able to make decisions to not follow the mandates, and because there's no need to, and actually they're all technically voluntary anyway. Even Governor Cuomo publicly stated that, and it's on YouTube. So if you're open to seeing that, then you can make much better decisions. And so that's I hope that more and more people are like that, but I don't know what it takes to go from the closed aperture to one that's open just enough. I think there's, something there that maybe somebody can influence that, but I haven't figured it out at all.
Well, recognizing the truth on any level requires a lot of self-responsibility. If you think about a lot of the things that we entertain in natural medicine or just self-sufficient living, it would require people make a lot of changes in their own life. They might have to change jobs. They might have to change relationships. They might have to take risk that they aren't ready to take. They might suffer ridicule from their peers. They might get let go from their jobs. I mean, there's a lot of fear there. And I think that's what, is used against us. We're so entrained to, be inclined to go for safety and security rather than looking at this as an adventure, and defaulting back to the, more the mechanics of it on that electrical side of things. We all put things in place that supersede the natural symmetrical patterns of nature. And that's what creates all of our problems in our finances, our health, our relationships. And that is, in fact, what I believe gets carried over from lifetime to lifetime. And those forces would be easy to change, but they have the emotional content associated with them that maintain the intensity and the velocity to keep them, outpicturing in our affairs. And so I think it really just gets down to that simple level as, is a person really ready to just let everything go and take great risk? And of course, those of us that have taken little baby steps for a long time, by the time you get around to making a change, you take a big, deep sigh of relief and you say, God, what took me so long? This is great.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And, you might describe that as cognitive dissonance, right? Where you have two opposing ideas, and one would make you change your entire life around, and the other one would keep things status quo. So you stick with that. And it does, take quite a bit of responsibility. And, Neil Kramer, who's someone I've worked with in my spiritual development, has a maxim that says, truthful living disturbs untruthful living. And, I've experienced this in my life, and it has definitely damaged and totally transformed relationships with people. It's also allowed me the opportunity to create new relationships with other people who are more open to, seeing the truth. when it's there. And so sometimes, like, what happens is someone has a glimpse outside the matrix, and their apertures just open a little, and they may say something's fishy about this or that, and then they realize the consequences. Suddenly they're like, oh crap, if I go that route, my life is going to be totally turned upside down. So let me just go back into the Matrix, right? And even in the movie The Matrix, right, we saw that one of the characters, after was woken up to the truth and was fighting with the rebels, right, made a deal to go back to sleep, right, because it was just easier. Even though, really what he was volunteering was to be a complete slave.
He wanted that steak.
Yes, the steak. The steak.
Yeah. You hit on a great point there, which is the idea of spirit and spiritualism. And of course, it seems like the trend right now is just to disconnect us from spirit. And that's what vaccines do, and the digital and everything is disconnecting us from our primal spirit, because that's really what gives us the connection to do the things that really bring us happiness in the end. It's like, you got to do is put some work in to have that experience. I mean, like for me, some of the greatest emotional highs I get is when I really get a crazy workout in and do a crazy 10-mile run, and it's like sometimes I'm dreading it, but once you do it, you're just like on this natural high in the top of the mountain here that I do these trail runs, and you're like, God, I'm glad I did that today. It sucked at the beginning, and during some parts of it, it was terrible, but in the end, I feel amazing and I'm healthier for it. And I feel like our society has just really gone in the route where it's all about immediacy, getting, immediate satisfaction from things. And everything's just so in this nanny state where everything's just given to us. And that's all, specifically done for a reason. And, getting back to spirit and the spiritual side of things is so important. And that's what really Alfa Vedic, why we're building this community out, is so that people can have a place where we can share these ideas without any judgment and can explore these concepts and come together in this kind of, digital virtual community, if you will, but also in a way where we can have these discussions and talk on a more kind of real humanistic level, so that people can kind of get out of the fear matrix and have a support system, because I feel like that's so important. As you said earlier, we are a communal species. We're a tribal species. We need the support from each other so that we can, bridge out from from this conditioning we've had our whole life. And so I think it's important that with what you're doing, Andrew, and going on all these shows and really educating folks about stuff with their microbiology and much more beyond that, and what we're trying to do. And I will say I'm a inherent positivist, if you will. I'm always trying to push the positive side of things, because as you said in the Hermetic laws, there's the one side here, one side here. There's always a balancing, right? I forgot what law that is.
Yeah, polarity.
Polarity, thank you. And so while we're seeing this extreme kind of negative side with the forced vaccinations, that they're pushing these agendas for tracking everyone, I was just watching this video of Bill Clinton talking with Gruesome Newsom from our state, where they're talking about how they can't wait to get the tracking app out, and as you said, it is voluntary, but people need it for their own health and safety. And Bill Clinton's sitting there going, you're doing such a great job and going to get this app out, and we're going to finally track everybody. I mean, they're out in the open about it, because the polarity is there. Like, that polarity is there. But on the flip side, we're talking right now, and we've got people on DLive right now who are chatting and are having a blast. And we've got shows like Crow 777 and guys out there that are just bringing out this information that is getting massive. And while we have the censorship, we've got stuff like blockchain and decentralization that's coming out that will allow for this to get out. So there's always a balancing, and there's always the flip side. And so my point is like, it's really easy to get down and out with this stuff, but when you understand these basic laws and these basic principles, there's so much amazing stuff happening right now. And I think this is the most exciting time to be alive ever. And I personally believe we all chose to be here at this time to go through this, and grab life by the balls. It's an adventure. Go out and make the change you want to see. and life will reward you in spades beyond measure, as I'm sure you're starting to experience right now, Andrew, with everything you've been doing.
Well, I'm very fortunate because when I started opening myself up to really seeing the full nature of the truth about many of these issues, I had a friend who he was encouraging me. I think he saw that I was open to it, and he knew that I would be ready. And he kind of kept giving me a little bit of breadcrumbs here and there. And finally, I took the bait. And then he was ready to come in and tell me, Andy, listen, you've got to open yourself up to some spiritual inner work to balance this out. Otherwise, you're going to, go into this sort of catastrophic fear state, right? Because you realize that so many things are just so fucked up that you can panic. And in fact, I'm working with someone right now who's going through this process, and we have a call after this, and I'm going to help just ground her a little bit and try to push her in the right direction. And so that's how I came upon Neil Kramer, and what is really, he definitely has a lot of good things to say, and I learned a lot, and I learned what to, where I can explore things, and I learned that it's a very individual work, and that you have to figure out your own path. It's not a formulaic recipe. But one of the things that came out of that is that a group of fellowship amongst people all going through that, all at varying stages of trying to do this kind of inner work. And we support each other through that. And it's been just a great way to balance out, the stuff that's really disturbing to learn about. And so when I started realizing, which was, pretty early on, that this, COVID pandemic was not what it appeared to be, in addition to, doing research and looking at material, I was also focusing on the inner side, like, how can I come to the truth about this? How can I, take care of myself? What do the people need on a spiritual level, in order to deal with the situation and figure it out? And I had this, moment because after having all the intention about trying to get to the bottom of it, and that it was really important, for humanity overall, that on a Saturday evening, it just came to me, this whole idea about the exosomes. And before I did any research on it, I heard somebody mention it. That was Tom Cowan. And then it was like the whole theory just came into my awareness. And I've never really experienced that before. Like, I've had those aha moments, but only after I immersed myself in research. And in this case, I had the aha moment before I did the research. And then I went about doing the research, and I did it at a quite intense pace. I think, for about 36 to 48 hours. I only slept a few hours. I ate maybe one meal, and I was just consuming all this research to figure it out. And everything I was finding just confirmed this information that came to me almost magically. Right. And so somehow, because of maybe the universe made it happen, maybe there was something about me that made me a receptacle, but this information just came into my awareness, and it turned out to be really, really accurate. And if I didn't spend the time and effort the last several years to try and do this spiritual work and develop myself into a more mature, more moral, better person, I don't think I would have been capable of that experience.
Walter Russell at one time was asked by an individual how he possibly created all he did in his life, because he had actually a greater body of work that he left behind than Leonardo da Vinci. It's something that most people don't realize. And Walter just simply said, well, it's easy. I don't do anything out here. He simply completed the picture in his mind. And then when he did a sculptor or created a free energy device or understood what the transuranium elements that people were searching for and knew exactly where to find them, and then, went ahead and shared that with the scientific community at the time, he just had the answers automatically. He said, you never waste your time tinkering on the outside or looking at anything out there. And that is the classic definition of old world alchemy as well.
Wow, that's really fascinating.
that goes too with the whole, like I just did a 48-hour screen detox, and I think it's important to do that. Crow 777 talks about this a lot too, is stepping away from all that and just being by yourself. We've really lost that concept, huh? You know, because we're so connected and we're so tapped in, and the idea is we can get information like that, but that's all external. And going back to the internalization, and you know, on the positive, I am seeing a big resurgence in meditation and a lot of these internal practices, qigong and stuff like that. And I mean, that's what the great masters always did, is they went internal. And that's an amazing point there, Bear. And I know Walter Russell even, didn't he like go into a coma or something for a while, and then came back out and then all these charts he started drawing? I mean, yeah. Pretty fascinating stuff.
The longest one was 49 days. Well, there's a reason why this country was created as a constitutional republic, and that is that every individual is a sovereign of their own world. You know, sure, we have a government that works on our behalf to just keep certain infrastructures going, but they take orders from us, but nobody can tell us what to do. And things worked very well for a long time, which is how this country rose to prominence. Yeah, we sure had our problems, but you know, it was a great experience. And now we're subjected to a lot of these things that are inverting that, as they've done with all things. And of course, a lot of us are concerned that we're losing our freedoms, but there's no way you can lose the freedom unless you give it away or grant authority to somebody else. So that's the biggest deception. And that's why, you know, returning to the land, just if you live in a city, grow your own garden, just those small little steps in self-sufficiency, growing your own food, taking care of your own body, taking care of your own issues, creating a business rather than working for the IRS or something. You know, it's very empowering. And then that really builds on, you know, what we think of as a spiritual level, but it's really not spiritual. There's no separation between the parts. It's just who we are. We are a pure consciousness that are putting, you know, that prana or that universal canvas in motion by what we think, believe, and feel. And I share Mike's optimism because, you know, everything is in full view right now. What we're actually seeing is the Klingon spaceship completely uncloaked. And we had to get to this point, you know, before they could make their final move. They had to show themselves. So more and more people are saying, wow, has that been there the whole time? And, you know, so more people are waking up. We had to get to this point. Just like in a sick body, sometimes when you treat it with bioterrain medicine, it seems like it's getting worse before it gets better because you're getting everything to the surface and out in the open. And that's where we are as a society right now. And it's real tempting to get seduced into think that everything's going to hell in a handbag and in a handbag, but it's actually the opposite. These are the best of times. And then, of course, understanding that we are the creative force in the universe. The more of us that come to that realization, rather than getting down in the dumps and just saying, you know, the person you're talking about that works with you, Andrew, very wise words to say, yeah, if you're not balanced out, then it's very easy to get morose with your tail between your legs because it sure looks bad out there right now. But no, these are the times that we've been waiting for.
It's such a you know, an apparent irony that it is the time we've been waiting for, right? And I agree with you guys. I'm looking very optimistically toward the future because I think this, I see myself, you know, living in the future completely free of all of this centralized authority kind of society that we've been in, right? Where everything's about control. But in order to get there, right, we have to sort of face this big challenge. And if you can easily, you know, go into a different kind of outlook, right, where you, and, you know, I think my initial reaction was along these lines, you know, that, all right, we have to arm ourselves and be ready for a revolution and, you know, and fight for our rights. And it's going to be bloody and nasty and everything like that. Right. And I think that's kind of a trap because that's really doing the same kind of thing that they're doing to us. And, you know, the higher ground is to step outside of that adversarial combat warfare relationship and realize that, we are higher beings and we don't have to go to that level. We don't have to cooperate, right? Because it is our choice. And maybe we inadvertently gave consent to participate in these systems, throughout most of our life, but we can change that. Now, we can decide that we are no longer giving our consent and that we're going to follow our, God-given inalienable rights in how we behave. And we're going to demonstrate that we follow the higher moral principles, that we obey natural law, that we're not out there to do harm to people. We're out there to cooperate with people. And I think that's really our true nature. And we've been so fooled into thinking that it's not our true nature, that our true nature is savages, that we would, gladly kill each other and steal our resources to enrich ourselves, right? And if you look at movies and TV and pop culture and even pop music, right, you see that theme played out over and over and over again. And to the point that we start to believe that, this is what people are like. They're inherently dangerous. And the current policies definitely amplify that, right? Because we see people with masks and, who wears masks outside of a costume party? It's people trying to hide their identity, like bank robbers and bandits,
Antifa.
Right? So Antifa, exactly. People who are terrorists, right? That we need to be afraid of. So, it's really important to be able to acknowledge this and step outside. And I know that, there's lots of evidence that our true nature is cooperative and supportive. Because look what happens when, someone that identifies as in need of help, everybody rushes to their assistance. And that's just a natural way that we are. And we can get back to that. And our relationship to nature and the land is a key aspect to realize our true nature.
Well said. I think, it's probably time where we start winding things down a little bit. Mike, you tell me how we're doing. Yeah. But I just wanted to make a quick comment before you have any final comments, Andrew, about people that are wearing masks. One thing that we don't consider is that the lungs discharge more toxins from our body with every exhale than any other elimination organ in our body. So it may not be a good idea walking around breathing your own exhaust all day long.
There are so many negative things about the masks. I mean, you can't get enough airflow through it. Your point is an excellent one. And then also, depending on what the mask is made of, you're inhaling particulates or vaporized volatile chemicals from the mask itself, which are no doubt toxic.
Yeah. Real quick, back to your point, Andrew, on the nature of humans and, that we're constantly push this idea that we're all savages and we're going to steal from each other if things get tough. Well, Vice did not that I'm a big fan of Vice, because I feel like they're a propaganda arm probably run by the CIA now, but Vice News did a really interesting piece on the last music festival in the world. I don't know if you saw that, but it's these folks went down to this, and as a DJ and stuff who's thrown festivals, I love this culture, and I think it's really cool, actually. But there was this remote festival down in Panama, and they all went down there in March and got stuck down there, and they were forced to shut down. And long story short, they're still there, and they're thriving, and they're living off the land, and they're happy, and they don't want to leave. And it's become like kind of a great experiment of people that have from all walks of life, different parts of the world, are now forced to live off the land in this paradise, really. And it ended up being like a really, even though Vice had all these typical little injections of fear and the virus and humanity, fighting each other. In the end, they had to admit, these people seem pretty darn happy. So it was pretty great. I recommend watching it.
Yeah, I'd love to check that out. That sounds amazing. And Panama has even much stricter regulations than we do here. They only allow you to leave your home, like to go food shopping 1 or 2 days a week for a short window of time.
It's like China. Shout out to Robert in our Telegram. He's an expat that lives there. Is giving us from the ground a really amazing commentary about it all. In fact, our family was supposed to go to Panama for spring break, and he had sent me a ton of info on it, and we were really looking forward to Boca and all these places. And of course, in March, early March, I was saying, no way in hell we're going to Panama now. And that these festival goers somehow thought they could still go mid-March, and they were kind of shows that they weren't really tapped in. But hey, they're pretty stoked because they're living in paradise now, fishing, eating crab, and picking coconuts. So good for them. We can wrap it up now. Any parting words for our community, Andrew? This has been a great talk. We really appreciate the time you put forth today to be with us.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I've said a number of things, and I think, this is a really nice community and of free thinkers and, focused on health-related issues. And so I'm just privileged to, be invited here and have a forum to talk with you guys. I wish we could have more ongoing discussions because I feel like there's a lot I can learn from you.
Beautiful, beautiful. And Bear, and just to say that too, I know you're in our Telegram group, and anybody who wants to continue this conversation with our community, we are very active. I took 2 days off and I came back to like 900 missed messages. So it's a little overwhelming in some respects. I love you guys though, and I appreciate you so much. And I'm so happy to see our Telegram community just exploding, and there's just amazing thinkers in there and really keeping me on my toes. So I appreciate you guys. And Bear's in there too. And we've got a number of amazing influencers and professionals, practitioners. And really what we're trying to do is create that new community, that groups of communities and tribes of people that can come together and create the new reality that we all want to see happen. So, being proactive and doing it in your own life is important. So if you guys want to join us on Telegram, it's t.me/Alfa Vedic. And then, of course, you can find all of our information on our website, alfavedic.com, which we're very excited about our new website launch, which we've been working on forever, but it's about to launch, and it will be much more focused on our farm and our new products that we're releasing. We got a new Carbon 60 lineup that's coming out with a C60 citrus CBD product that's really exciting. We've got a whole new aluminum line coming out that I'm really excited about. And of course our new Life Force protein line and the Spagurics that Bear is working on, which will be out early fall, it's looking like probably, which will be our Jiao Gulan Spaguric, and which is our main herb that we are focusing on along with a number of others. So check us out on alfavedic.com. And of course, if you're listening on YouTube or watching on YouTube, please subscribe, hit the like button. You can join us live every Thursday at 10 a.m. on dlive.tv/Alfa Vedic. We're really trying to grow on this platform. We're trying to be less and less on the YouTubes and Facebooks of the world. I personally would love it if I never had to go on those platforms again. But unfortunately, due to the nature of where everything is right now, that's where most people are. So you can find us there. However, we are working with a project called Cortal to initiate a new decentralized internet. I'm working on a project called ManifestX to initiate a new type of monetary system. So we're always working on things. And I think, Bear, we're going to plan on doing a Crypto for Dummies show next month, hopefully, with Jason from Cortal. So that'll be fun. We've got Justin Franson on next week to talk about 5G from EMF Rocks. And we'll just continue these conversations. And we appreciate you guys. Thanks for joining us today. And Bear, any parting words for our community?
Just thanks everybody for being out there. And again, thank you, Andrew. You're phenomenal. Just, you're doing such a wonderful service. And I think the whole message behind all this is just we're circling the wagons and all the kindred spirits are finding each other. And that's what this is all about this time here.
Wonderful. Perfect parting words today. Love you guys. And get out there and grow something. Get your hands dirty if you can today. Cheers.